great honor for me to introduce Professor Mary-Louise Gill, teaching at Brown University. I suppose everyone here is familiar with excellent works by Professor Gill on Plato and Aristotle, or Aristotle and Plato. Well, her publication includes Philosophers, Plato's Missing Dialogue, 2012. So, Professor Gill, may I pass the microphone control to you?
Thank you, Satoshi. And thank you so much for inviting me. My one regret is that we can't all be there together in Seoul. I would have loved to have come, but I will hopefully be able to come another time. But thank you so much for this invitation. Okay, so my paper is called, and it's called Images of the Philosopher in the Prologue of Plato's Sophist. In his valedictory address as Lawrence Professor in Cambridge before moving to All Souls, Oxford, Miles Bernier gave a lecture called First Words, advocating that we follow Proclus in interpreting the prologues of Plato's dialogues. Proclus believed that Plato imaged the main philosophical content of the work in the opening scene. Bernier demonstrates Proclus' claim with many examples. The Republic opens with Socrates recollecting going down to the Piraeus, where he witnessed a celebration and a beautiful parade, a passage prefiguring his later command to the philosophers who have profited from their higher education in the ideal city to go back down to the mundane world and rule, mindful of what they have learned in the realm above. The symposium opens with the image of going up from the harbor, heralding the speech of Diotima, later expounded by Socrates, about climbing up the ladder of love to see the form of the beautiful. Neither Bernier nor Proclus discusses the prologue of the Sophist, but this prologue seems ripe for study in light of Proclus' insight and the dialogue's main philosophical themes. Does it give an image similar to those in the Republic and Symposium, a foretaste of the main philosophical themes to expect in the upcoming work? Okay, this is now the section called Philosophical Themes in the Sophist. The Sophist prologue opens with a group of dramatic characters, including, does everyone have this up now on the screen? Someone has, Satoshi, did you put this up? Okay, so that's good, then I don't need the handout. Okay, so the Sophist prologue opens with a group of dramatic characters, including Socrates, the mathematician Theodorus, and his two students, Theaetetus and Socrates the Younger. The same four individuals had taken part the day before in a discussion of knowledge recounted in the Theaetetus. Today, Theodorus has brought a guest from Elea, home of the philosophers Parmenides and Zeno. The guest will lead the upcoming discussion. Socrates asks him what those where he comes from meant when they used the names sophist, statesman, and philosopher. Did they name three kinds as the names suggest? Two kinds, or do the three names all apply to one kind? Answering the question is easy, says the stranger. There are three kinds attached to the three names. The hard part is distinguishing the three. Reluctantly agrees to undertake the task of distinguishing them and selects Theaetetus as his respondent. The main discussion begins with the guest's announcement that they should start the investigation with the Sophists. He says, this is text can if you're looking at the handout. You must seek in common with me and start first, as it now appears to me, with the sophist, seeking and revealing by means of an account what he is. For at the moment, you and I possess only the name in common. The work to which each of us gives that name, we may perhaps each have privately ourselves. But we should always in every case agree about the thing itself through accounts, rather than agree on the name alone without an account. It's not the easiest thing in the world to grasp the tribe we now intend to seek, the sophist, what it is. In the next pages, the guest begins with a simple example, the angler, and demonstrates the method he plans to apply to the harder case. He concludes that in the simple case, they agreed on both the name and the work. The work, fishing with a hook, displays the angler's expertise. Possession of that expertise makes someone an angler. Definition is harder in the case of the sophist. As the guest shows, he and Theaetetus have the name in common, but they may conceive of sophists and their activities in different ways. In his search, the visitor uses the method of dichotomous division. Starting with the generic kind, eutechne, he divides that kind into two subkinds, one of which includes the target with his special expertise. Then he ignores the left-hand branch and divides the right-hand branch into two further subkinds and repeats the process until he locates the target at the tip of one branch of the tree. The effort reveals a problem, because the inquirers may have different conceptions of what a sophist is. The guest finds the sophist not at the tip of one branch, but at the tips of branches all over the divided tree. He finds him on 6 different occasions. So why does the sophist appear in so many different ways? The guest applauds Theaetetus for expressing his doubt, then sums up the 6 definitions and declares, do you know that when someone appears to know many things and is called by the name of one art, that appearance is not sound, but it is clear that the person experiencing it in relation to some art is unable to see that feature of it toward which all those sorts look. And so he addresses the person having them by many names instead of one. The inquirers have so far missed the essence of the sophist, that feature responsible for the appearance of manifold expertise. Some, maybe all, sophists hunt rich young men, but lyric poets and many others do too. Some, maybe all sophists, sell their own intellectual wares, but so do others. Some sophists are agile debaters, but so are others, and some sophists may lack that skill. Perhaps Socrates was a sophist and belongs in the group exposed by the 6th division and definition. Certainly, Aristophanes treated him as such in his comedy Clouds, and Socrates defended himself from the charge of sophistry in his trial depicted by Plato in the Apology. On the other hand, the 6th division and definition may have mistaken a philosopher for a sophist. The abundance of divisions suggests that none captures the feature of sophists that explains why they appear in so many ways to people who encounter them. Although anything can be picked picked out by its accidental features and so fail to capture what the thing really is, with the Sophists, this error is not entirely our fault. As the visitor goes on to show, the Sophist is a sort of wizard, someone who pretends to be wise about all sorts of things without being wise. What skill accounts for his appearing to know things he does not know? What is the essence of sophistry possessed by the Sophist? The visitor's summary and observation about what they are missing reorients the discussion. How can someone appear to possess knowledge he lacks? What is it to produce false appearances? Appearances that can either correctly represent or distort the way things really are. These questions lead to the heart of the Sophist, to the puzzles about not being and being, and the resolution of some of them by interpreting not being as difference. The reconstrual of not being allows the negation and to analyze falsehood as it actually is, and equips him finally to return to the search for the Sophist and to define him as someone who imitates the wise man by distorting reality with false statements and appearances. I got a notice that my connection was unstable. Maybe I should pause and ask if I can be heard. I see some nods. Can I be heard? Okay, I'll carry on then.
There are distortions sometimes.
Right. What? There's distortion.
Yes. It comes and goes.
It comes and goes. I'm sorry. Well, you've got the paper.
We're fine.
I'll read it, and I mean, I am reading it, so you have it, and I will do my best to be here. And I hope I can be here for the discussion. Okay, so I now want to look at the prologue of the Sophist in light of what I take to be those main themes of the dialogue. The search, the many divisions and definitions of the Sophist. He appeared in all these different ways. There's something wrong with us. He appears in so many ways. This is a passage that Noboru Notomi has wonderfully discussed in his book on the Sophist. And then that we get the discussion, and we go into then the puzzles about not being and being, and then the reinterpretation of not being as difference, and then the making sense of negation and false statement, which allow, and then also false appearances, which are important for the Sophist. And then finally, we come back and define the Sophist a seventh time. So that's sort of what I take to be the main themes of the dialogue. Now we go to the prologue, and we'll talk about that. To herald the philosophical content of the dialogue, as Proclus proposes, it contains surprises. Despite allusions to Sophists, individuals who, like the Sophist as later portrayed, can be mistaken for others. Let us now look at the details of the prologue. And the guest statement, which I started with, where he has taken Theaetetus as his interlocutor and says, we're to start with first. Okay, we looked at that passage to be the section of the dialogue leading up to that announcement. We're going to go through, I won't translate all of it. So the first question is, who is the guest? Theodorus opens the meeting by introducing his guest. This is text 1 if you have the handout. We ourselves have duly come according to yesterday's agreement, Socrates, and bring this special guest, his family from Elea, a companion of those around Parmenides and Zeno, a keenly philosophical man. Who is this mysterious person? He will lead the discussion. Theaetetus, Sophist, and a discussion with Socrates, the younger in the Statesman, but is never named, simply addressed in a vocative as oxene, guest. We learn in Theodorus' opening remarks that the visitor comes from Elea and is a companion of those in the circle around Parmenides and Zeno. Regards him as a keen philosopher. Socrates perhaps mocks Theodorus' gravity in replying, and this is text 2. Theodorus, has it escaped your notice that you are bringing in the words of Homer, not a guest, but some god? Homer says that gods, and not least the god of guests and hosts, while accompanying people who partake of just respect, observe the overreach and order of human beings. So maybe this man belongs among the superior beings and might accompany you in order to watch and refute our poor performance in arguments, being some god of refutation. Theodorus notices that in comparing the visitor to a god of refutation come to watch over our good and bad performances, Socrates might be mocking the visitor. Readers will recall that in the Apology, while defending himself from the charge of sophistry, Socrates claims for himself a sort of human wisdom, that of knowing that he does not know, and facetiously attributes to sophists a wisdom more than human. Maybe the guest has come to observe our arguments and refute us for the love of winning. Maybe the guest is a sophist. Theodorus recognizes Socrates' implication and corrects him in text 3. He says, that is not the way of our guest, Socrates. On the contrary, he's much more measured than enthusiasts for heuristic. The man seems to me to be not at all a god, yet divine. For I call all philosophers that. More than once in the prologue, Socrates suggests that the visitor is a sophist, masquerading as a philosopher. Later in the discussion, while still pressing the guest to undertake the hard job asked of him, to tell them how people where he comes from distinguished sophist, statesman, and philosopher, Socrates asks him to answer one small question about procedure. Says, and this is text 6, then yes, don't refuse us the first favor we ask, but tell us this, when you want to demonstrate something to someone, do you usually prefer to go through it yourself, on your own, with a long speech, or through questions in the way Parmenides once did in my presence, when I was young, while he was then very old? The visitor replies in text 7 that it's easier to use the method of question and answer. As long as the respondent behaves without causing trouble and obediently. Plato's readers will likely recall a similar discussion in the transitional section of the Parmenides, when Parmenides reluctantly agreed to demonstrate the arduous exercise he was recommending as long as he had a pliant respondent. He wanted the youngest person present, someone who would cause least trouble and be especially likely to say what he thinks. Readers will also remember the performance of the young interlocutor, Aristotle, in the second part of that dialogue, who indeed caused no trouble and stands out for his enthusiastic applause, especially when Parmenides' arguments are particularly obscure. Aristotle was utterly unlike youthful Socrates in the first part of the dialogue, who made numerous good proposals when Parmenides grilled him with questions about forms and showed that he needed more training before positing them. Socrates' insinuation that the guest would prefer to hold forth in a long speech, like a sophist, rather than use the method of question and answer, allowing intelligent replies from the interlocutor, seems not to be lost on the visitor. After Socrates proposes that he choose one of the young ones and recommends Theaetetus, the guest replies, and this is text 8. I'd feel a bit ashamed being here with you for the first time, not to conduct the meeting in small steps, but instead to prolong it by extending a big speech by myself, or even to someone else, as though presenting a display piece. For in reality, the question raised is not as slight as one might expect it to be, as stated just now, but actually calls for a prolonged argument. In turn, however, not to gratify you and those here, especially since you spoke as you did, appears to me a bit rude and uncivilized. I completely welcome Theaetetus to be my interlocutor, given both my earlier conversation with him and your present recommendation. Display pieces, Epidexives, are especially associated with sophistical performances, such as speeches by the sophist Gorgias, Protagoras' long speech in the Protagoras of Plato, and Lysias' speech in Plato's Phaedrus. Interrupting the flow of a speech with mere expressions of agreement gives a moment to catch one's breath, but does not encourage the interlocutor to participate fully. Theaetetus in the Sophist and Socrates the Younger in the Statesman play much more active roles in asking questions than did Aristotle in the Parmenides. But unlike the youthful Socrates in the first part of the Parmenides, in the first part of the Parmenides, and Theaetetus in the dialogue, Theaetetus, the interlocutors in the Sophist and Statesman do mainly follow the visitor's lead. They ask questions or make mistaken suggestions. Without diverting, their interventions consistently move the discussion forward or provide the guest a teachable moment. And I regard this as important, their role, that they don't sort of get us off track, they move the discussion forward. If we reflect on the upcoming discussion, and especially if we include its continuation in the Statesman and the guest's expressed intention to present the philosopher as well, we realize that indeed the task the guest has agreed to undertake calls for an exceedingly long argument, as he said in text 8. The guest differs from Socrates in teaching, but the prologues gives the impression, amply confirmed by the discussions in the Sophist and Statesman, denied in a paper I just attended, that the guest is a philosopher and a conscientious teacher. Moreover, he is exceptionally gracious, especially in the face of Socrates' unsubtly masked suspicions. Okay, so in the prologue, perhaps the banter between Theodorus and Socrates early in the prologue about whether the visitor is a philosopher or simply a clever debater, a god or somehow divine, which seems to foretell the many upcoming appearances of the Sophist, and then the final seventh one. So we might expect that in the prologue, except that Socrates is not talking about the Sophist. He is talking about the philosopher. And this is what occasioned my title, the title of this paper. So this is text 4. Well said, my friend. He's talking to Theodorus. Nonetheless, there's a risk that that kind is not much easier to discriminate, if easier is the word, than that of a god. For certainly those men, not the fake ones, but the genuinely philosophical men, appear of all sorts as they frequent cities, because of the ignorance of others, looking down from on high at the life of those below, and seem to some to be worthless, while to others worth all the world. And they give some the impression of being completely mad. Yet I would gladly ask our guest, if it's all right with him, what those around the place he's from thought and named those kinds. Which ones? Sophist, statesman, philosopher. If this were simply prefiguring the argument in the Sophist, we would expect Socrates here to describe the many ways the Protean Sophist appears, for that's what will be demonstrated of the Sophist, leading up to the many appearances, reveal that the person experiencing them has missed the feature of the Sophist responsible for his appearance of manifold activities. But nonetheless, in light of Proclus' idea, Plato's image the main philosophical theme of the work in which they are. Passage in the prologue of the Sophist offers evidence that the philosophical work at issue is larger. Final response to Theodorus, Sophist, statesman, philosophers than often. Okay, I lost my connection. Can everybody hear me again? So I was just approaching the end of that section. What I'm claiming is that the prologue suggests a work that is larger than the Sophist alone, that includes the statesman and philosopher, all three kinds that that Socrates asked the visitor to distinguish. Can you hear me? I'm being told again that my connection is unsteady. Just nod. Okay. All right. So he wants an account of all three kinds. An account that marks them off from one another. The claim that the Sophist is part of a series to be followed by the statesman and then philosopher. Okay, this section is called, if in fact the prologue of the Sophist heralds the series of works examining the sophist, statesman, and philosopher, why does the guest present the sophist first? He ultimately defines the sophist as an imitator of the wise man, Sophos. Is the wise man the philosopher? If so, don't we need a portrait of the philosopher in order to understand his imitator? The guest, in fact, presents a striking portrait of the philosopher in the sophist. In the midst of his discussion of dialectic, in the middle of the dialogue, he exclaims that in his search for the sophist, he chanced upon the philosopher. He goes on to sketch the difference between the sophist and the philosopher. Whereas the sophist slinks off into the darkness of not being and occupies himself and spends his time there, the philosopher, through reasoning, always occupies himself with the form of being. He resembles the sophist in being hard to see, but in this case, we are dazzled by the brightness of the place. The guest then teases us by saying that we'll consider the philosopher more clearly soon, if we still want to. So perhaps our question is answered, at least in part, because the guest characterizes the philosopher as well as the sophist in the sophist. Still, whether or not we get an adequate portrait of the philosopher in the sophist, and so need no separate dialogue philosopher, the project still demands a portrait of the statesman. The statesman marks off the genuine statesman from pretenders to statecraft and declares the imitators to statecraft to be the greatest sophists of all. The genuine statesman has a special sort of knowledge lacked by the pretenders and also by his subordinates whose work he oversees. Furthermore, in differentiating the true statesman from claimants to statecraft, the guest compares the genuine statesman to a true doctor and true navigator, experts who aim for the good of those in their care, but are sometimes mistaken for fakes. They are themselves sometimes mistaken for fakes. So there is some generic kind covering all the genuine experts as opposed to quacks or fakes. And the obvious label to apply to all is genuine expert or knower. Individuals belong to that group in virtue of their knowledge manifest in their activities. We should now notice that the generic kinds divided, the expertise or techne in the search for the angler and sophist, and knowledge, episteme, in the search for the statesman, have not themselves been defined in the sophist or statesman. They are simply posited as the wide kinds to be divided in the search for the relevant target. Look for an account. To look is the Theaetetus, which investigates the question, what is knowledge? Episteme. We should now notice that the Prologue of the Sophist looks back to the Theaetetus as well as forward to the upcoming series, a strategy Plato uses on one other occasion. The Prologue of the Timaeus looks back to the Republic as well as forward to the truncated series Timaeus Critias, which ends in mid-sentence, and missing Hermocrates. I was told again that my internet connection was unstable. Give me a nod if I'm there? Okay, good. All right, so now I want to talk about the Theaetetus and the Prologue of the Sophist. The opening line of the Prologue explicitly refers back to the last line of the Theaetetus. So this was the opening line in text 1. Saying, in the morning, Theodorus opens today's meeting in the Sophist, saying in text 1, we ourselves have duly come according to yesterday's agreement, Socrates. As we have already noticed, the Theaetetus, Sophist, and Statesman feature the same dramatic characters, Socrates, Theodorus, Theaetetus, and Socrates the Younger, and the guest joins the group on the second day. The prologue of the Sophists contains additional reminders of the Theaetetus. In the paragraph, that's text 4, sort of the important paragraph describing the many appearances of the philosopher, Theaetetus characterizes the philosopher as looking down from above on those below. This description doubtless prefigures the gods in the battle of the gods and giants later in the Sophist, who defend their position from high up and claim that true being is immaterial forms. At the same time, the description harkens back to the digression in the Theaetetus, where Socrates contrasts the philosopher with a practical man. The philosopher ignores practical matters. His otherworldliness seems comical. He resembles a Thales falling into a well while looking up at the heavens, or ignoring his neighbor while asking grandiose questions like, what is man? The prologue of the Sophist this is text 6 from our earlier, if you have the handout, also recalls the Theaetetus while more explicitly recalling an occasion depicted in the Parmenides, when the youthful Socrates met the venerable Parmenides. The same occasion is mentioned in similar words in the Theaetetus. On that occasion, if you'd like me to read it, well, he just speaks of having met Parmenides when he was young and Parmenides was old. Okay, so the same occasion is mentioned in the similar words in the Theaetetus. On that occasion, in Plato's drama, the previous day, the day before this one, Socrates refused Theaetetus' urgent request to examine Parmenides and gives as his reason that he could not do him justice in a short space. And moreover, such a discussion would eclipse his current question. What is knowledge? Precisely the question whose answer we now need in the Sophist and Statesman. Moreover, we should note that Socrates identified knowledge as wisdom, Sophia, at the start of the Theaetetus. The guest's definition of the Sophist at the end of the Sophist as imitator of the wise man can therefore be fleshed out once the various branches of knowledge, including statecraft, philosophy, arithmetic, and others, are grouped together under their common kind and differentiated from one another by their objects. We can now answer my earlier question. Why is the Sophist first in the series? Well, the answer is the Sophist is not the first dialogue in the series. Its prologue looks back to the Theaetetus as well as forward to the series Sophist, Statesman, and Philosopher. So my final section is titled, What is Sophistry? And it's going to be rather open-ended. I look forward to the discussion. I end with a question about the nature of sophistry, a question stemming from the identification of the sophist as imitator of the wise man. On this topic, too, we get a provocative foretaste in the prologue of the Sophist, when the guest uses phrases about the manner of the upcoming performance, which point also toward the substance of the conversation. This is text 7. The visitor says, if the respondent behaves without causing trouble and obediently, it's easier in the second way, to speak to him, to pros allon. Otherwise, by oneself, to kath hauton. In his reply, the guest mentions two ways. He might proceed either by himself, to kath hauton, or in dialogue with an interlocutor, to pros allon. In this way, he casually introduces two expressions that will become technical terms later in the dialogue, auto kath auto, itself by itself, and pros alla, in relation to others, used to mark off the two great kinds, being and difference. According to that later discussion, being operates in both ways, both auto kath auto and pros alla, whereas difference operates only in the second way, in relation to something else, pros heteron. The method used in the search for the sophist, dichotomous division, is plainly a way of differentiating the sophist in relation to others, pros alla. We are left to wonder, what is sophistry in its own right? Auto kath auto. Is the ability merely parasitic on the arts it imitates, or is it a genuine art in its own right? The guest locates the ability at the outside in the wide kind expertise, techne. Is techne a kind wider than knowledge? With knowledge as one branch and mundane art, including angling, weaving, farming, and so on, as another? Should techne also include sophists and other imitators, such as actors, painters? Or is techne itself too grand a title for the sophist? Does the guest make a mistake at the very start of the sophist in selecting techne as the wide kind to be divided? Does the sophist have some lesser ability? Plato sometimes claims that sophists have a mere knack, tribe, or experience, empiria, a designation Socrates unkindly applies to pastry baking and cosmetics, as well as sophistry in the Gorgias. As Leslie Brown pointed out in a paper of hers, what is the wide kind that includes knack, mundane practical art, and knowledge? And how should benign imitators be marked off from dangerous ones? Thank you.
So, time for question. Please use the raising hand function. Yes, okay, yeah, Jan Taif?
So yes, hello. And so I have the following just a small point. So you use this term Epidexives to put, to give a display as something to be associated with sophistry. You know, when you talked about the kind of trace of the xenos that might allow to connect him with sophistry. So I wonder, that's not a little unfair, or maybe that's the wrong way of putting it. I wonder if we shouldn't connect that with the way the Eleatic philosophers communicated their philosophical arguments at large. After all, he is introduced as someone who comes from the Eleatic school. So if you look at the beginning of the Parmenides, I mean, not the framed dialogue, but when the framed dialogue begins, you know, Zeno has just finished reading his book out loud. So So Zeno would be an example for someone who writes, well, not a dialogue, but you know, arguments, kind of dialectical arguments, but it's not a dialogue. So it's, and of course, Parmenides himself also kind of gave a speech in meter. You could argue that it's perfectly fair for the Eleatic visitor to say, okay, how do you want me to give you an answer through question answer, or by, you know, just expounding my argumentation in one continuous tract, reading a book being just the sort of equivalent of giving a, you know, philosophical account without question and answer, like from memory. So that's my question.
Thank you. That's an excellent point. So if we have does anybody have the handout? So the handout, I think it's passage 8. Yes, well, the visitor, I mean, one gets the idea that basically he does need to give a very long argument. And he thinks it would be impolite. Right. So he speaks of that it would be, I'd feel a bit ashamed to do this display piece. But in fact, it calls for a very long argument, and especially if we think that it not only calls for the sophist, but also the statesman, and maybe even also the philosopher. Having somebody reply, you know, especially if somebody's going to reply the way, you know, young Socrates would, you know, where they have lots of good suggestions, or the way Theaetetus did and said, can't you tell us about Parmenides now? And so I think you're absolutely right, and I think I should, yeah, it might cover Eleatic methods too, and he has the, but I do want to stress that it's these interlocutors here in the Sophist and Statesman are not like Aristotle in the second part of the Parmenides, who really only said, you know, absolutely, certainly, most true, you know, and especially, you know, was enthusiastic when one might want to say, wait a minute. So this visitor, although he does seem to be in the Eleatic tradition, and I think you're right that the Epidexis is maybe shouldn't just be restricted to sophists, that others also, including maybe Eleatic philosophers, would do this. But I think that this visitor is also a teacher. That's one thing that strikes me about him, and especially in the Statesman, where he, you know, he doesn't sort of invite, he's different from Socrates, in that Socrates always elicits the answer from his audience. But so he will often propose or just basically give, say, a choice to young Socrates, where it's Socrates younger, where it's sort of obvious what young Socrates is supposed to say, and he gets it wrong. You know? So he does it in order to sort of teach something. So I regard him as a teacher and as well as a, sorry, we're all back together. Okay, so as well as a philosopher. So I think that might help. But I think Epidexis, I should modify what I say about that. So thank you.
Okay, then Nobu Notomi.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mary-Louise. Nice to see you online.
Good to see you.
Yes, I'm very glad to remember that when I was a student in Cambridge writing the thesis on the Sophist, you kindly read one of the chapter. I don't remember which, but and gave me some remarks a long time ago. So, I have a question. Reading the beginning of the dialogue is always very important, and you carefully analyze it. And your question about why the Sophist is the first is very interesting, because we take it for granted that the series is from the Sophist, Politicos, and maybe the Philosopher. But why? I think that your text, crucial text in the first 2, 3, 4 have some additional problems there. One is elenkos and eristic, and the text 2 and text 3, the kind of the conversation between Socrates and the heretic visitor, Theodoros, about whether the heretic visitor is elenctic or eristic. So that
Right.
is one things, and also another distinction between the God and the divine, theos and theos, because the Socrates added that a philosopher may be taken to be mad, manikos. Manikos, I think, reminds us of the Phaedrus philosopher, divine madness or, mundane madness, that kind of thing. So I think this come together. And you asked also the question about who is a heretic visitor, heretic guest. Then I think that's, it makes me think that it's natural first to define the Sophist. Otherwise, we don't know who is the heretic visitor, whether he's a Sophist or not. Then I think there's a Sophist, the dialogue Sophist, that the heretic visitor guest is a kind of the focus, while the statesman, it's not obvious, that he is such a character as to ask question about whether or what he is. So I don't know your opinion about the distinction between eristic and elenctic. It's, of course, in a sense, correspond to the fourth definition of the Sophist as eristic, and the fifth definition of the eristic, and the sixth definition of noble Socrates, noble lineage, elenctic one. So do you have, maybe you can tell something more about this distinction? Thank you.
Mary-Louise, you might...
Yeah, I was muted, excuse me. Okay, so that's really helpful. So the first is, so in text 2, Socrates says that you brought us a god of refutation, a god of elenctikos, right? So there he seems to be suggesting that the visitor is divine, and it may be reminding us of Parmenides' fragment 1, sorry, not fragment 1, but fragment 7. Isn't that where you listen to my elenkos? So maybe he's, I mean, it's Theodorus's reply that makes me think that Socrates is being, maybe saying, look, maybe he's like, some god, has God's knowledge, the way I talked about it in the Apology. That was the thought I had. But then, okay, do we have this? So Theodorus it is who says, he seems to be, Theodorus seems to be treating elenkos and eristic as the same.
Yeah.
Is that right?
Yeah,
so maybe Socrates is not being as, maybe what I'm getting from, both from Jan's question about Epidexives and your question about elenkos, maybe it's with Theodorus that we're here that we sort of start thinking, oh, maybe he's some sort of sophist.
Yeah,
Maybe Socrates is not doing that.
Yeah, yeah. Obviously, that Theodoros is not a specialist, and he's confused about the distinction. That is probably obvious from the text too. So, so that's why the first they need to distinguish between the philosopher and the sophist to continue the definition of the statesman and philosopher. Otherwise, it's very difficult to do the politicos first.
Well, but right. But my problem is, how can you do the sophist? If the sophist is an imitator of the wise man, don't you need to know what it is? This is why I think we need the Theaetetus. We need the wise man. Yeah, exactly. And yes, both the philosopher and the something happened to my screen. Both the philosopher and the statesman are examples of wise men, and there are probably other sorts of wise men. But don't we need the wise man before we can get the imitator of the wise man? That was my
that is a problem, and we need to consider well, the Theaetetus as well, or maybe the Parmenides as well. But yeah,
right. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yang, am I right in taking you as a raising hand again? If so, go ahead. Yang, your mic is off.
I keep making this mistake. Sorry about it. So I wonder about connecting the introduction of the Xenos as a elenctic god, ironic or otherwise, connecting it with, the passage in the Philebus that characterizes the method of division as a divine method. After all, I mean, part of the tediousness of the, especially the Politicus, which you're right now reading, Davis, so is that he goes through all these divisions in a lot of detail, and lays false paths in order to then correct himself, and so on and so forth. And uses very different Greek language in the course of just pursuing pretty straightforward divisions. But that seems to indicate that really he could be viewed as an embodiment of the method of division, with all its tediousness that it can take on. But while being very important, of course, for Plato, I would think. So, I mean, that's just basically suggestions. Maybe you would then wonder why he's introduced as Theos elenctikos and not diaretikos, But that's sort of a follow-up consideration one would have to have. Yeah.
Right. Interesting. Well, this may connect up with the question of whether we think, when you speak of the division with all its tediousness in the statesman, and then the Philebus, I mean, as I read these, okay, as I read these dialogues, and including the Philebus, these are different methods of division that we get in different places. So we get, this dichotomous division, which does get rather tedious in the Sophist, and we get it again at the beginning of the Statesman, where, I think some mistake on Socrates the Younger part is being demonstrated with this incredibly, supposedly, it's supposed to be funny, where we end up with the herdsman of the non-interbreeding, hornless, two-footed kind. But then we get a different kind of division, and I believe we've got division doing something different also in the Philebus. So it seems to me that it is some sort of dialectical method. It's sort of maybe a collection of related methods. And yeah, I mean, I regard both, that I think Plato thought of both Socrates and the Eleatic visitor as philosophers, but it was very different in their styles. Because the visitor does have certain things he wants to show, and he does have this method that he repeats. Of course, Socrates uses it in the Philebus and in the Phaedrus. So it's not, but Socrates seems a bit different in those dialogues from the Socrates of the Socratic dialogues, and including the Theaetetus, where he's not really putting forward theses. Anyway, yeah, I mean, this is very interesting. I would like to think more about that. Okay, I think I got a note from the Nick is next.
Yes, so, yeah, wait.
Thank you, and thanks very much for that paper and the discussion. I just wanted to add, not so much a point, just an addition to what people were saying about this elusive question of the God, telling the philosopher from the God. It is a question that keeps eluding the interlocutors in this dialogue and in the Statesman. I just wanted to point out that just as the Sophist begins with a few quotes from Homer about what a xenos is, so too it returns to Homer and the xenos at the very end with that little tag phrase that the Eleatic uses about this being the blood and the genealogy of the Sophist. That, of course, refers to the confrontation in the Iliad between Diomedes and Glaucus, where they turn out to be xenoi, but in the other sense of the word xenoi, that is, they have a relationship. And Diomedes, when he asks Glaucus to explain his identity, is specifically worried, given what has happened to Diomedes already in the Iliad, specifically worried about mistaking a god for a human being. So that's just my little addendum to what these others have said, that the problem of the philosopher's relationship to the god lingers at the end, and it's going to return in a different way later.
Thank you. That's fascinating. Yeah, the references to Homer, I was sort of looking at them earlier today, the ones that were in the prologue, which look pretty, they're interesting. I mean, I don't quite know what to make of it, but the fact that it comes back at the end is very interesting too. Thanks.
So yeah, it's time. So usually, Sun-Hun, could I take one last question?
Sure, sure.
Oh, okay, Yuji, go ahead.
Oh, thank you. Just a quick question. Who is a wise man in the Theaetetus? What do you mean by wise man in the Theaetetus? Are you referring to the ending of the Theaetetus, where Socrates mentions Sopron, as who appears as a result of Socratic ignorance?
Okay, let me just go grab the book. It's at the beginning of the Theaetetus.
Oh, okay.
So, and I'm just going to read you from Miles Burnett Levitt translation. Okay, so so he starts in and he talks about that Theodorus he teaches astronomy and music and so on. And then he says, and this is, okay, so this is 145D, just before E. And in the Greek it's by wisdom, isn't it, that wise men are wise, yes, with the instrumental dative, yep, like you get by beauty, the beautiful things are beautiful, and or by piety, what is it, by which all the many pious things are pious. Mm-hmm. And then he goes on at E and says, and is this in any way different from knowledge, episteme? Mm-hmm. What? Wisdom, Sophia. Isn't it the things which they know that men are wise about? Yes. So knowledge and wisdom will be the same thing. So we've got that sort of at the very beginning before, yes, we actually move into the, you know,
so it's discussion.
First attempt to say, well, knowledge is what Theodorus teaches.
Okay. Yeah, I just thought about Anthropine Sophia, which makes us a wise man. But yeah, just talking about general one. Okay, thank you. I intended to be quick.
Nick, your mic is on, right? No?
Oh, sorry.
Oh, no, I thought you wanted to say. So then, if there's no other question, then let's thank Professor Mary-Louise Gill. Thank you very much.
Let me thank all of you for this great discussion. It's very helpful.